First off, let's everyone say thank you to Shuffle, my mod who compiled all the questions and removed the ones that repeated themselves so that we don't answer the same question 30 times. So, the first question, Haran versus Missplitter, Haran versus Primordial Jade Cutter. About Ayaka weapons, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that because Blizzard Spray gives you a lot of crit rate, because you also get Cryo Resonance, like 15 crit rate from the Cryo Resonance, your baseline crit rate is 60%. That means that with crit rate main stat or substat weapon, you'll often find yourself, if you have a little bit of crit rate in your substats, overcapping on crit rate. And so the biggest problem with doing an Ayaka weapon calc is, let's say, right, you have really good artifacts that don't have any crit rate whatsoever. Then you're only wasting about 4% crit rate from that Jade Cutter, and the first 40% crit rate is all being used. It's all a useful stat. And so then the Primordial Jade Cutter is a very good weapon. But that also makes it so that those roll of crit rate into your artifacts become basically just worse than flat defense, because they're actually not doing anything. You already have 100% crit rate. Like, I think I have a few really good ones. So yeah, like this one, right? This is an incredibly fucking good artifact that has 18% crit rate, 6% crit damage. A feather like this on Jade Cutter is basically fucking useless. It basically has 6 crit damage, 5 ER, and that's it. But like objectively, it's a really good feather. And so if your artifacts look like that, right? If you have a lot of crit rate in your artifacts, the more crit rate you have, the bigger the difference between Jade Cutter and the other weapons will be. If your artifacts don't give you any crit rate, so let's remove this. Jade Cutter, about 10% away from Missplitter in this situation with these buffs. It's a 10% difference. But if we're looking at my artifacts, so I got 10.5 here, 3.9 here, okay, wait, so. Then instead of being a 10% difference between Jade Cutter and Missplitter, it's a 30% difference. Same applies to Haran, except you're wasting a little bit less of that crit rate because it doesn't have quite as much. Worse than Amenoma, yeah. 95% of Amenoma. But just keep in mind that just looking at this isn't gonna give you the full picture. It's very possible that you have a Jade Cutter that's like the second best option for Ayaka if you don't have any crit rate in your substats. This is an old calc. I don't remember which assumptions I use. This is with Kazuha, Noblesse, Her Resonance, or oh yeah, I have it here. Diona, Kazuha, I think so. Never mind. But yeah, it's obviously gonna really depend on your stats and on which team you're using. Heard on this TC podcast that mono cryo teams including Ayaka, Shenhen, Ganyu, and Kazuha actually has the highest DPS if Ayaka burst hits every hit. Was DPS calculation per rotation or just screenshot? Can I show us the funny math? I can't show you the funny math because I didn't calculate that, but it doesn't sound wrong. Like, it sounds like something that would be accurate. The biggest problem is that basically that's not gonna happen. It can happen against bosses, but most of the time it's not. Even if you don't look at how some of the hits from the burst can miss the enemies because it knocks them back. Having enemies frozen means you can have like 3-4 enemies all getting hit by your Ayaka burst at the same time. Basically, a team like this can be good in boss situations, but outside of boss situations, it's never something you should do. Like, any 3 of these cryo units, you would be better off replacing them for Barbara or any other Hydro unit if you're not against the boss. Is Ayaka a character that I would recommend building vertically? Considering pulling her C2 because you have Missplitter and Shenhe, want to make your freeze team stronger. So for those of you who don't know, vertically in terms of in the context of building characters basically means you invest a lot into a specific character. Because Genshin isn't a game where you like need to be hyper invested to clear. Once you've got your 36 stars, you don't have to keep making your characters stronger. You can start going into different teams that you want to play because they're different or anything like that. And so some people decide to build vertically, right, making their what's already good even stronger, and some people decide to build horizontally, giving themselves more options, right? So this person's asking, is Ayaka a character that I would recommend building vertically? I don't think any character particularly needs to be built vertically more than another, but Ayaka is definitely a character that if you go for investment into her constellations and 5-star weapons and supports for her, she definitely gets a lot of value out of that. So I would say that if you're planning on building a character vertically, you're probably not going to be completely disappointed with Ayaka. Like, she's gonna get decent damage output for what you put into her. Just remember, this game is shit and you should not spend any money on it. Kaeya or Rosaria as an Ayaka support, what's set on them? The basic difference is that Rosaria has a double hit and 3 baseline particles. If you proc 5, you get 3 clear particles, which is 3 times 3 plus 3 times 2, 15 baseline energy. On the other hand, Kaeya gets his E against frozen enemies is 4 to 5 particles, so 4.5 average. And if you use him with 5, you end up getting quite a bit more energy. But because it's only a single hit rather than a double hit, it's harder to get that crit. If you have a low refine on your Favonius, it can be a little bit annoying to play a Favonius Kaeya as a battery for your Ayaka. On top of that, Ayaka has the crit rate buff, although just like the Jade Cutter that we talked about earlier, it's very possible you're already at 100 crit rate through your substats or whatever, which means that the crit rate buff might not actually give you all that much. And what's said on them, it's gonna depend on what the rest of your team has. Noblesse is always good, but if you're using something like Xingqiu as your Hydro slot, you're probably going to want him on Noblesse. So it's generally either Noblesse or Blizzard Strayer. Is Ayaka viable outside of freeze teams or outside of a Blizzard Strayer set? That's a difficult question to answer because, like, you're still going to be able to clear even if you don't use an optimal Ayaka team, because Ayaka is just a very good unit. The best way to use your Ayaka, though, definitely not. The best way to use Ayaka is, like, without contest, on freeze teams. If you can, you want to play her on a freeze team. If you're not against an enemy that can't be frozen, you want to go for freeze. If not, if you end up using her in a team that doesn't use freeze, you're gonna heavily struggle against enemies that are not heavy because her burst staggers them to Narnia basically, and you're only gonna get like 1 out of 5 of her hits to actually deal damage to the enemy. Even a lot of like somewhat heavy enemies like Meta Charles get staggered to Narnia as well. If you're gonna go for that, you can basically put her in any team. Like if you're against a boss, her burst just deals a pretty high amount of damage. You can basically just treat it like a Zhongli burst, where you just use it and it deals a lot of damage, except unlike Zhongli's burst, it actually does deal a lot of damage, you know? My favorite non-freeze Ayaka team is probably just Ayaka National, honestly. Will Melt Ayaka always be a meme team? I mean, I guess it's a similar question to the last one. It's fine, right? Melt Ayaka's fine, but only against heavy enemies. And like, it's not really Melt Ayaka. It's just Ayaka, who's not really triggering reactions, and Xiangling, who's not really triggering reactions. But the units are really strong, so it's kind of gonna work. Actually, you know what? I should probably look into how well Sunfire Ayaka does, because I would assume that Sunfire is enough to keep the Pyro, so you do get all of the melts you can get on Ayaka, which is like 7 hits, I think. I haven't looked into it too much because the use case for it isn't really that high, and Ayaka's damage is high enough that even when you use her against bosses with a freeze team, you just don't swap to your Hydro unit and she still can kill the bosses, so there's not much of a need for it. But I should look into it, honestly. In a team with Ayaka, Ayato, Venti, Diona, is it possible to double swirl Cryo and Hydro without making the rotation way too dag? Kinda, yes. Basically, it's weird. So if you look at, I guess they don't have Ayato yet, but Ayato is all 1U, right? And then Ayaka, her E is 2U, right? Yeah, if you do 2 followed by 1, you have to attack until it does this, and then you get your double swirl and you're fine. Otherwise, you can just do 1 followed by 1 like this and this, right? There's a setup to get your double swirl just while the enemy's frozen. But honestly, I think it's a waste. I think you're better off just Hydro infusing anyways. Not as a bad idea to cast Diona and Ayato's Burst before Venti EQ. Oh, I would always cast Ayato's Burst before. Oh, you're using Diona, not Rosera. Same thing though, actually. It should still be basically the same thing where, so we're gonna have our Ayaka. This is definitely Ayaka. This. Ayato Q. That's not fucking Venti. That's not Venti. I don't have a lot of brain cells, okay? Jesus fucking Christ. Okay. Ayato Burst. Venti Burst. Diona EQ. Venti E. Fuck. Ayaka EQ. Ayato E. Probably don't need to do the E on Diona. You can probably use the E like on Diona like right here. Battery it into Ayaka, get another thing here, and then start over. When does an attack goblet start being better than a cryo damage goblet on Mist Splitter? It's a good question. I wonder how many attack substats start being worse. So let's look at Mist Splitter. Let's unhide this. With Kazuha, let's look at Kazuha and Mona, right? It's basically a tiny little bit better, but it's about as good. But if you remove that Mona it's not quite as good. But if you have Mistsplitter and Kaza and Mona, attack doublet is a pretty good option if you don't have too many attack substats. Obviously, this is 5 attack substats. You should probably trying to be aiming for more than 5. So generally, that attack doublet is going to be slightly worse than what we just saw. But yeah, so it's going to depend. Generally, it's not, even when it's better, it's only ever like slightly better. So only really go for an attack doublet if it has better substats. And even then, if you're not using Mistsplitter, might not even be worth it. How highly would I recommend her to an account with a few teams already built, but with no cryo DPS? Pretty highly? I consider Ayaka to be probably the best, like, single unit carry. Or, like, single unit improvement to an account for a carry. What I mean by that is that most of the other good carries that there are in the game are relatively heavily reliant on units that are shared by other good carries. Ayaka is surprisingly viable, surprisingly decent, using only Kaeya, Animo, MC, and Barbara. Right? Only units that are available for free to literally everyone, and that other teams generally don't want, apart from Kaeya, but you said you don't have another cryo DPS, so I assume that's the case for you. And she does surprisingly well, because in her optimal teams, you don't really use her auto attacks and charge attacks that much, but they're actually not terrible. And if like the rest of your units are not very good, you can still use them and you'll still be fine. She doesn't require a lot of the expensive supports, and that makes her incredibly valuable for accounts where you can only go for like one carry. That being said, like, there's still gonna be value in going for units like Raiden, units like Hu Tao, but those units are reliant on a specific unit. Raiden is very reliant on Bennett, and her teams that don't use Bennett are generally quite a bit worse. Even though she does have some pretty decent, like, Electrocharge teams, don't get me wrong, but it's not being able to use a Bennett on a Raiden team hurts. So generally, when you go for Raiden, you're benching Xiangling. And what are you doing on your other side? I know that, like, for example, Tenten gets a lot of criticism for people saying, like, why does he mention Xiangling in every video? Why does it matter that Xiangling exists? It matters because for some people, the Xiangling team is already able to clear very easily, and it's the other side that struggles. And just replacing your Xiangling team with something else without making your second side better isn't exactly what you want. It's not ideal. If you're going to be replacing your Xiangling with something else that can potentially in some situations perform better, you want to already have another team that performs well also. Like, you can't just only have your Xiangling team or your Raiden team instead of a Xiangling team perform well. You need 2 good teams. And because of that, units that rely on the same supports as Xiangling generally end up not being quite as valuable unless you already have a good second team. And Ayaka is like a really good unit at being that good second team, which means there's a lot of value in pulling her. Obviously though, she's not the only thing you can pull. Do not spend money on this shit game. It is not worth it. But yeah.
Hello, Zajef. I might missed that part, but could you explain why everyone so suggesting Mona in Ayaka team? Frankly, she's got so poor hydro application while Ayaka's burst pushes back most of the enemies, and other part of enemies are highly...
Yeah, basically, Mona is like, if you play Mona in an Ayaka team, it's very possible you'll find yourself in a situation where you need to go to Mona and auto-attack the enemies and use your, like, alternate dash to reapply Hydro to keep them frozen while your burst is going. But because she's just a, like, straight-up buffer, she's pretty good when your Ayaka burst is, like, not quite able to one-rotation the enemies with Kokomi or with Xingqiu. Mona's gonna help you get there. But I do agree that she's not quite as good as a lot of people think in Ayaka teams. How important are the other parts of her kit, like her autos and skill, to her overall damage output per rotation? Honestly, they're not. Min-max Ayaka teams will generally barely use charge attacks and normal attacks on Ayaka. You basically use them to wait out the cooldown on your battery, because you're better off spending time batterying her than using her normal attacks, because her burst is so good that being able to run lower ER, aka spending more time batterying with your Kaeya or Rosaria or whatever, is generally going to be a lot more value than using her charge attack. You still use some when like their skills are on cooldown and all that shit, but it's really not that much. Her E is really good, but it's not good because of the damage. It's good because it gives you a lot of particles, and it fits well in rotation. You can get 2 per rotations, which is basically 9 average in a rotation, which is a pretty significant amount, right? And so, like, if you catch all those, that's 27 energy, just like that from her E, which is pretty solid. Like, it's a good skill, but the damage isn't like wow massive woo. Like, it is good damage, but it's like, it's definitely not what you want to be maxing first. How future-proof is she? I think she's a pretty future-proof unit because she has a lot of damage, like enough damage for her teams to compete with other meta teams, and on top of that, she has freeze. I don't think they're ever gonna make another unit like this. If they do, I think it's like actually gonna be power creep. And from what they've been doing recently, I got a little bit worried about power creep with Yelan, and then they nerfed her back, right? And so it does seem like they want to stay away from power creep, which is smart if they want to keep the game as a moneymaker long term, right? Too blatant power creep makes players quit, because it makes them feel like they spent money for nothing. So I would consider her pretty future-proof. She's a very strong unit. How worth are her constellations? So the big thing about Ayaka's constellations is C1 is bad. This shit is dog shit. God, it's so fucking bad. So it suffers a little bit from the Raiden problem, except it's even worse than Raiden C1. Because like realistically, you're getting 2 E's per rotation no matter what, whether you have this or not. It's not enough to get you 3 E's per rotation. And so it has a little bit of the Raiden problem where if you're not going for C2, there's no point to going for constellations. And that also makes it a lot less approachable for free-to-play players that have been saving their Primo Gems, because guaranteeing C2 is a lot of Primo Gems, right? Guaranteeing C2, let's go with soft pity instead of hard pity, because most of the time you're gonna get at least, like, generally at around 80 wishes, right? So that's 160 for C0, 160 for C2, 160 for C3. For C2, sorry. So that's like almost 500 wishes you need to save up in order to guarantee it. And if you don't have it guaranteed and you get unlucky and you're stuck with C1 and not C2, you're gonna be like, oh fuck, I mean, I already got the C1. Like, shit, I might as well fucking swipe for the C2. That's what they're trying to do. And it's very fucking obvious, right? Because it's possible you get it earlier, that C2, right? On average, you're gonna get it it's gonna take you about 90 wishes per. So that's 270 total, right? On average, you're gonna get it, but like almost 50% of the time, you won't. And then you're gonna be like, well, fuck, I guess I gotta swipe. Because you don't want to stop at C1. Point being, a lot like Mist Splitter, unless you already have the Primo Gems to at least guarantee it, I wouldn't recommend going for constellations. If you do go for it, C2 is a pretty good DPS increase. It's 40% more damage on your burst. C3 is a pretty good DPS increase. It's like 20-something% damage increase on your burst. And C4 is also a pretty nice DPS increase. It's like about 15%-ish, something. But it also increases the rest of your team's damage, not just Ayaka's. C5 is fucking useless. C6 is basically clickbait. This is a constellation that deals a big number for screenshot damage, and that doesn't actually increase your DPS very much. So I would say if you're a dolphin who wants to spend for Ayaka because you like the character, you like the playstyle, I wouldn't recommend going past C4. If you're a free-to-play player, because the C1 is so bad, I wouldn't recommend constellations at all. If you're a Welkin player who's been saving up for a year and a half, then maybe you can go for constellations. But like, yeah.